Daniel. First, I want to greet all of the audience that has joined us and to also express my greetings and my appreciation to the organizers of the Latin Media Summit. I'm Daniel Alarcón. I'm the editor of El Hilo, and it's my pleasure to be with Gideon Lichfield here today. We'll have an interesting conversation here. Gideon has a long career, was named global editor at Wired magazine, but many years ago was at The Economist and then was the founder of Quartz. In 2017, he was the editorial director of the MIT Technology Review. He's had a long career covering international affairs, worldwide business, and more recently, something that has been highly influential in all of our lives. In the last 5 years, he's covered the tech beat. Daniel, what a pleasure to meet with you here. Thank you. It's a pleasure for me. Let's start. I want to congratulate you on your new position at Wired that you've been in since March of this year. And tell us, define what is your role as the global editor, this new position. I'm the global editor of all of the international editions of Wired and also work as the general director of Wired US. So I'm responsible for all editions. At this point, we have Wired the US, Wired UK, Wired Italy, Wired Japan, and those are our current editions, our 4 editions that are part of the Condé Nast family. You are just now in this role. How different are these editions in your view? And are you looking to unify these, or is each one of these editions going to go on its own? Condé Nast is currently trying to unify the global editions of almost all of its publications. This is true for GQ, for Vogue, for Vanity Fair. They're all beginning to try to unify them somehow. The regional editions are not going to disappear, but they want them to work together as a team. This is happening also at Wired in terms of the English editions. The UK and the US editions are going to come together probably at the beginning of next year. We'll have a single digital site. We'll continue publishing different print editions in the UK than in the US, but we'll one single transatlantic Wired English team that will publish all the information that Wired will come out with under a single brand, under a single title. I imagine it's interesting to be at the helm of Wired at this time. We've gone from being charmed by technology to a new phase, disenchantment. We've gone from being thrilled to being now afraid that Facebook has somehow destroyed democracy. And this took literally the blink of an eye. For 2 decades, Wired was, and it really still is, sort of the insider's guide to technology. But how do you think that the magazine will reflect this change with the industry that it's supposed to cover? When Wired was founded in 1993, It really was the insider's guide. It was the Silicon Valley magazine. It had a very strong and intense connection with everyone thinking about innovation and all of the Silicon Valley companies. And it also had a sort of utopian, very optimistic view in accepting technology as almost as a religion in our lives, as technology was going to bring about happiness and it was going to change everything for the better. Obviously, our attitudes towards technology have changed since that time. As you said, we're a lot more ambivalent today over the role that technology plays in our lives. And Wired's coverage, as well as technology coverage generally, has changed. In general, we are now talking about in Wired at climate change. We're talking about the threat to democracy of large corporate conglomerates, the role of social media, the algorithmic bias that exists, and the biases and prejudices that can be replicated in algorithm. When we talk about the racism of technology or in the technology sector, these are all problems that are recognized today as being technology related problems, and they make up the coverage of issues for Wired. I think Wired needs to position itself as a publication that is about technology, on technology, and on the role of technology in our world. But also a publication about the important and largest problems facing the world. Because I think at the root of, or at the base of what Wired is, I don't think it's so much an optimism, but a framing of how we seek a better future. And what's changed is that in the past, we would say that technology was the path to a better future. But today, we say technology is part of the solution. Sometimes it's part of the problem. It's key, either way, to the way things are evolving. And the question we must ask ourselves as journalists and as Wired, as the magazine, is how do we change the world to overcome the problems that we're facing today? And what are the stories that we can tell and that can be told that'll show us the path? This somewhat more critical and I would say realistic view that you're describing inevitably leads me to ask, who is the reader of Wired's? At one point, it was thought that Wired was read in the tech industry and in Silicon Valley, and it was required reading for everyone working there. But I remember a couple of years ago, there was a cover with the face of Zuckerberg as if he'd been beat up in an alleyway somewhere. And I thought, this isn't going to be read on Facebook. So who's reading this? I don't know. You're at a time when the criticism is even sharper after the elections and after everything that we've lived through in these last years. How do you imagine that the reader of Wired has changed? Again, I would say that during the 90s, people interested in technology were Wired readers. And I think that distinction today no longer exists, really, almost. We're all interested in technology, whether we like it or not, because technology affects all aspects of our lives. So if 30 years ago, at the time, this would appear to be something exotic, almost as if you had a hobby and you were a technologist, or maybe you thought of it as something that was alien to you, that's not the case today. I think Wired continues to be read in Silicon Valley, continues to be read by people at Facebook, but people are reading about Wired and reading Wired not only there, but everywhere. I think a person interested in the future of the world is a Wired reader. especially if you're interested in how to improve the world. We all want, or we all can want a better world. And I think Wired aims at finding how we answer that question and understanding that technology is part of that answer and focusing on people that are involved in making these changes. One of the things that Wired is excellent at, I think, and always has been, is telling stories, reporting, in-depth reporting in the style of the best of the world's magazines that really get into the lives of the people. It's covering how people are being influenced by technology and changed by technology, and how they fight against injustice or to change a system or to achieve a goal or to invent something new. I think there are lots of stories like this that not only explain technology and help us understand technology, but they help us understand what is the interaction of the human person with technology. What do human beings do to try to change their environment and their world? Well, let's talk about specific technologies and some specific things, because from your experience in DUBBED and things that you know about, we all have a sense that things are complicated, and we could list problems that the world is facing today, and we could talk about it and fill the whole hour that we have. But one of the things that surprised me is a certain dose of realistic optimism, but nonetheless optimism. And if we are used to naming technology as something dangerous, as you mentioned, there are solutions there too. When you think about technology and you think about the experience of your 17 years of doing this work, what are the solutions that are possible? Well, let's start with the problems just a little bit, because they are serious problems. If we look at the world we live in today, we're facing the questions about the future of this pandemic, the future of economic inequality, of democracy, of the slow automation of the world of work, of economic injustice, economic struggles, the dominance of the large tech companies that are controlling more and more of our lives, the massive extinction of species that are related to climate change. And so I think it is different to look at this world and to be optimistic in the pure meaning of that word. However, I would say that we've moved from a sort of utopian, unjustified utopianism of the 90s to the other extreme, to a sort of techlash of the last years, since 2010, maybe. An unjustified pessimism, because we realized all of the problems that technology could bring about. And when I say we, I'm talking especially about us as journalists. We began to sound the alarm that all of this was headed in a bad way. I think the question is, what is the responsibility or the role of the journalist, not only to sound the alarm and noting what is wrong, but also how to give people, if not optimism, at least hope, to see what paths are available to us moving forward. I do think there has been a certain change in the zeitgeist, in the sense, since the pandemic. We've created these vaccines in record time. Normally, creating a vaccine takes years or decades, but the COVID vaccines were invented in weeks. In fact, what took time really were the trials, the tests to make sure that the vaccines were effective and safe. So the mRNA technology that gave us the possibility of creating these vaccines is something that was developed over the course of decades without a successful application. And all of a sudden, it is a solution not only to the pandemic, but to many other health issues and many other health problems and challenges. In the future, I think this will open a brand new chapter for biotechnology. Artificial intelligence to date has been used mostly by companies like Facebook and Google, and mostly it would seem to make those platforms very, very powerful in social networks, or to bring about the work of companies like Uber, making life either more entertaining or more convenient. But now we see applications using artificial intelligence for diagnostics, medical diagnostics, or to find new chemical formulas to invent new drugs. So I think that there will be applications of artificial technology that can really that can solve real problems. There are other ways in which we can look to a personalized kind of medical care that is based on data collection using devices in our own bodies or at home that will allow us to have a much more close monitoring of our health conditions. The use of CRISPR for synthetic biology, for example. There are many applications that in the coming years will be able to help us, could help us at any rate, to solve the problems that we face today. Of course, there are also dangers from the application of these technologies, especially in the area of surveillance and the data collection on humans that are a real threat and will continue to be a threat to our privacy. So I'm going on and on about this, but the point is that there's a certain notion that we have reasons today to be more optimistic because there are new possibilities as a result of technology. And I think that the role not only of Wired, our magazine, but journalism in general, is to differentiate, to analyze, and to see what are the trends and what are the trends that we can be hopeful about, and how do we make sure that these solutions are brought about while avoiding the most problematic use of those technologies or the applications that would be most problematic. You mentioned this titanic achievement of mRNA vaccines, and I wanted to ask you about the pandemic specifically. How do you think that this has changed your mission as a journalist? Every 3 minutes, I'm reading the word unprecedented, right? And I think that word has sort of been overused last year, but we keep using it like something we've never seen, something we've never been able to imagine. Has this changed your way of understanding your own role, your own mission? I don't think it's changed my way of facing my job or my profession. When I was still at the MIT Technology Review, we had to reorient. This happened with many publications. We had to reorient our entire coverage, our entire reporting function. Every reporter became a pandemic reporter. Every reporter had to start working in and on issues that they were not well versed in. So the idea of abandoning the traditional coverage areas, the traditional beats, of putting everybody on the same story, on the same beat, or working on very, very nuanced aspects. A reporter that used to cover space or the space industry all of a sudden became the reporter on COVID testing, something super specific. And the reporter who covered cybersecurity all of a sudden became the reporter on the issue of contact tracing. So I don't know if that changed. I think so much. Really, it just showed us that we could be a lot more flexible, and we needed to reimagine what the role of a journalist was, or of an entire newsroom, to face this challenge together. And at your publication, did reporters adapt easily to this new world and to not being able to see each other in person and to have to report remotely to face this unprecedented challenge? At that publication, yes, it was relatively easy. We were already a somewhat remote group. Half of our team was not in Cambridge, so our meetings were already on Zoom in the newsroom. We were already used to it, and we were a small team as well. It could be harder for a larger newsroom or a larger reporting team. Since we're talking about technology, I will do something that I forgot to do. Be right back.
Okay, so I'm going to be like the hold music, but I'm not going to do it. And so in the meantime, if I didn't finish that, I'm sorry. Uh, we're all here just gossiping about your apartment, your background there. Okay, so let's continue. Gideon, those of us who know how a newsroom works or what a magazine is like, you haven't put your stamp on this magazine yet. You haven't changed Wired because what's coming out in this issue was created months ago, and so you know it's your magazine as of about the September issue. Tell us, how are readers going to notice that it's changed? So there will be two things. First is a greater focus on these big problems that we face. So we've already covered them, but I think they're going to have a more central place in our coverage, and we'll have more of a global focus. Wired traditionally, well, not just American, but specifically Californian, very focused on Silicon Valley. Today, innovation, advances in technology are happening not just in Silicon Valley, I mean, a lot of places of the US and a lot of places of the world. And I think every country wants to have their own Silicon Valley, but I think that we're just now reaching the point where certain cities have a critical mass of technology or of centers of excellence for certain technologies, like London or Tel Aviv would be for finance, or let's say Toronto for artificial intelligence. So technology is being developed in a lot of places of the world. And also problems that we cover, like the ones I mentioned, are happening everywhere in the world. And the stories of how people face a problem like climate change or economic insecurity or what have you, those are global stories that happen everywhere. So what I think we're going to see is that what Wired publishes is going to feel more global. The stories are going to come from more countries, and they're going to be understandable in more countries as well. So it's not going to feel so local because the issues are not local. And then would you plan to have more coverage of Latin America then as well? But yes, also. Wherever the story is that's interesting. Okay, good to know. Sorry, the interpreter did not hear that. So there you go. Breaking news for everybody. So, Gideon, so our clan, our tribe, professionally, perhaps are pessimistic to a fault. I mean, a certain cynicism that is almost performative. And sometimes it's as if somebody is optimistic, we don't even take them seriously. And so what I wanted to ask you is about that. So Wired is a very serious magazine, and you've said that it's not going to be a sort of blind optimism or anything like that. But how do you deal with this pessimism, this sort of theatric pessimism that journalists, as if, everything, all is lost all the time? Well, it's not that I'm not pessimistic. Generally, I'm not terribly optimistic in nature. But I think the way to do it is to really find nuance in that pessimism. And so the pessimism can be a way to look at the world as it is. Because pessimists say that they're a realist. And so looking at the world as it is and talking about those problems, but not stopping at that. Not stopping the analysis of the problem there, but rather saying, okay, it's a bad problem, but what is the next step to fix it? Who is trying to fix this problem? Even when there are stories about people who have failed. If I think about stories that Wired has published in articles over the last few months, there's a very good story that came out recently about some researchers, academic researchers, who found the reason for which, well, okay, now I'm going to get in trouble in my Spanish. The differences between droplets and aerosols. Oh boy, yeah, no. So the droplets and aerosols, and so it's a critical distinction in terms of how we combat COVID, because it defines how the virus particles move through the air. So whether you have to use a mask or not, or whether it's better to wash your hands to avoid contact, those recommendations depend on our understanding of how the virus circulates through the air and how quickly it falls. And so public health policies at the beginning of the pandemic were based on washing your hands instead of using masks, because there was a misconception about exactly this, how the virus circulated. And so we published this story about how these researchers went and searched the ancient history of public health to understand where that misconception came from, to then be able to convince the CDC and the WHO that their policy was incorrect and to change people's minds. So that is a story about people who came up against a serious problem and succeeded. It was a great story. And I think I heard an interview on NPR of the journalist, and it was fascinating. Very, very interesting. And we've also published stories about people who are trying to change a system. It's like a person in Texas who was basically trying to modernize the voting system using automatic voting machines. And so we still don't know if that is going to succeed or if that's going to be done away with. But the point is, we can always tell those stories of people who are trying to achieve those changes to see what your reader can learn from those experiences. A reader that wants to see a better world, whether those experiences are successful or not. And so that's the point of finding that nuance in the journalist's perpetual pessimism and going a step beyond that to find what is good. So we can see how this begins to change. And so I would like to invite the audience to type their questions into the chat, any questions they would have for Gideon Lichfield, who is global editor for Wired, technology magazine here in the US and in the world. So Gideon, so what is the Platonic ideal of a Wired story, and how is that different from the stories that you have put out throughout your career for The Economist or for Quartz? And I would also like to ask you, over the course of your career, what have you learned at each of those places? What is a lesson for those listeners we have? What is it that you take from each of those places that you carry with you forever? So I'm going to start with the second question, because what I will always carry with me is, I think it's my motivation to be a journalist. What always interests me about this is I've wanted to understand why people perceive the world the way they do and why conflicts arise when different people see the same situation in different ways. And so what I've learned throughout my career is the importance of the story, of the narrative that we construct to make sense of the facts, to create this understanding of what happens. And so wherever we may be, we always have our narratives that shape our understanding of the world. And it's very hard to change those narratives. And to a certain extent, that's the problem that we're having now with disinformation. You can't change somebody's mind who believes something just giving them better information. You have to also change their way of thinking. You have to strike a chord emotionally somehow so that they can see things differently. I would say that in most of the workplaces where I have worked, the emphasis has been on information, on the reporting, on analysis, and good information. And what Wired has that my other workplaces don't have is that focus on narrative and narrative journalism that really gets deep into people's motivations. And so that's why it's exciting for me to work there, because it conjoins my interests in technology and global affairs and fuses that with a keen sense of human nature, which at the end of the day is what's underneath all of these problems. And so understanding one person's journey through a good story is key to change people's minds a little bit about important issues. So I have a question from Caro Gil Pose, who says, she uses a phrase that I don't know. What Gideon is saying, that change in perspective that he wants to offer with solutions-based journalism. That's what I'd never heard about before. From watchdog journalism to guide dog journalism. I love that. Could we say, what is Wired's primary focus in terms of deciding what stories they publish? So solutions journalism has a bad reputation. Well, but it has a bad reputation because of what I've said before, because journalists are enormous pessimists, and they use that as their weapon, as it were. Well, and maybe because I'm one of those naturally pessimistic journalism, I have a certain association with solutions journalism where I say that that's too optimistic or too solutions focused. So in technology, there is this solutions mindset, which is, let's unveil this amazing technology and this is going to solve the problem that we have. There's an app for that, as it were. Exactly. And so that was Wired's philosophy in yesteryear, which was to say, by applying this technology, we can change the world. But if you don't change human beings and their motivations and economic and power structures, you're not going to change anything. And the technology simply ends up replicating the problems that you had before, but in a different way. And so that's why I don't like solutions journalism as much, but I do like the idea of journalism's being a guide dog insofar as, so here's the world. Like I said before, here is the world. There's this problem with the world, and this is how you have to start. If you are somebody who cares about the future, these are the steps that you need to start to take to be able to make those changes. If that is solutions journalism, then so be it. But that doesn't mean that watchdog journalism is not necessary, because it continues to be very necessary. And so accountability journalism, something that uncovers corruption, uncovers bad decisions, that's extremely important. And that's something that Wired also does and will continue to do. But I think that this can coexist with that next step, as I was saying. This is what's wrong, but what can we do now? So Patricia Zurbarán says, many of us have not integrated metrics about our audiences when we're thinking about what stories or issues are of interest to them. What relationship does Wired have with their consumers? How do you use technology to better reach them? Well, I would love to say that Wired has the most advanced technology in terms of reaching out to our audience, but that would be untrue. We use the same metrics that a lot of other publications use, and we very closely follow what people are reading, what they like, what converts them into subscribers. But in terms of really having a relationship with the community, I think we still have a lot to work on there. And so I am hopeful that by focusing on certain issues that are big problems in the world, we'll be able to create those relationships with certain audiences or certain groups of people who also want to solve those problems. And that could be done perhaps through specific publications or events or newsletters. I don't know. I think there is still going a lot of experimentation happening within journalism in terms of how to build those bonds. But I can't say that we are the most innovative in that regard. Okay, well, then I'll tell you what we've done at Radio Ambulante. I wanted to ask you, Gideon, so to the extent that you can, talk to us about the big stories that you're working on for this next phase of Wired. Well, I can't say too much in detail, but like I was saying, we're really looking at these big global problems in terms of how optimistic can we be? How much are we entering into a new age with technology, not only to make life more convenient, but to make the world better? What are promising technologies in this regard? And we're also going to be looking out for dangers that could arise over the next few years. And so I was just talking about the potential of artificial intelligence, but there are also dangers in that, not in the way that people think that artificial intelligence is going to become truly intelligent and then take over the world, but rather more and more decisions that affect our lives. If we receive credit, or what price we pay, or where we live, what jobs we're able to get, or where we are considered, how we vote, a lot of those decisions are starting to be influenced by algorithms. And so the invisible hand as it were, of artificial intelligence is changing our lives. And it's not very transparent, and we don't have a lot of control over it as individuals. Something else that worries me a lot is what is now being called synthetic media. Deep fakes are an example, but synthetic media is a broader term that refers to Hollywood actors who are effectively created, because you can take an actor and turn them into an actor, but you can also recreate the image of dead actors using a different person. This happened, I think, with somebody. And so that use of synthetic media is creating a lot of opportunities that didn't exist before for industries like Hollywood, but is making it harder all the time to know what is true, what really happened, and what it was made up. And it's going to change creative professions tremendously. So I don't know. It's a very long list. Sounds great. So something I've read a million times in Wired that I would like to never have to read again are these profiles that are almost messianic about tech giants, tech bros, almost always men, who are going to save the world or are going to make an enormous amount of money, or sometimes both things at the same time. Right, both at usually at the same time. And so it's like an almost orgasmic form of journalism that we're all going to be rich and happy. But are you going to do away with those? Honestly, if you look at the covers of Wired over the last few years, those have been eliminated. I remember, like you're saying, if you were to do an inventory of our archives, a lot of the covers were those rich white men, or who were men who were about to be rich. And then among those covers, I remember a cover that was of a girl who's maybe 11, 12 years old, possibly Latina by her complexion. And the title said, "The Next Steve Jobs." So even when we weren't putting Steve Jobs on the cover, we were still obsessed with the idea of Steve Jobs. And so that's not happening anymore. Now, covers, the people who we're putting on the cover are much more diverse, and there's less focus on people and more so on issues, ideas. Yes. Yes. And when we write about people, increasingly it's about people anywhere in the world who could be somebody who you've never heard of, who you don't know, who's not famous, who is never going to be rich, but who is facing these big problems that I mentioned their own way, in their place, and finding a solution that anybody can learn from. So Patricia Zulbaran has a very interesting question. What are the fundamental differences that you've noticed between younger journalists who are almost digital natives and older journalists in terms of how they approach sources? Well, I don't notice difference. Are they able to frame stories differently? That's a good question. It could be that younger journalists are more open to other ways of telling stories, or they're less traditional. But it could also be true that more experienced journalists were also like that when they were young, and they've just found their path at this point. So I think younger journalists might be more open to experimenting with audio, video, TikTok, different formats of telling stories, how you're going to tell a story. How do you reach your reader? And perhaps beyond that, they might be more open and different means of communicating with their audience, with their community, which is something that happens outside of the confines of the article, of the journalistic product, and is part of their conversation in Twitter or wherever that may be. But that happens with more experienced people as well. And so I don't know. I can't really point to clear differences and say that that's something generational. So, Gideon, we're almost at time, but I would like to finish with a question. As an editor, in your role as captain of the team, do you miss reporting? Do you miss that work as a newspaper or as a journalist, as a reporter? And how do you fill that void? I miss it all the time, yes. And so I think being an editor, being able to manage a team of very talented people is something that fills the void. So I can't go and report an idea, but I can give that idea to somebody else who is going to do it perhaps better than I could. And that way I can influence and shape or decide what it is that we're going to publish. That's one way to even go further or have a broader influence. But yes, of course, I do miss reporting. So thank you, Gideon. Thank you very much for such an interesting session and for your time and for your work. And I wish you all the best with the magazine. We will definitely be looking out. And I would like to also mention that Graciela put a link in the chat for Wired. You can find it there. So thank you very much for being with us. Gracias, Daniel. Thank you, Daniel. Bye.